I'm catching you between what's the tour called? What's this sort of mega endless
Oh,
tour called?
well, so basically, many years ago, we made a bunch of tour-specific merchandise that we didn't sell through at the end of the tour, which was kind of a problem. So I slightly sarcastically started saying, "Well, next time we'll just call it the Never-Ending Tour of Everywhere," and then you can use that kind of whatever it was, posters or T-shirts forever, and it's kind of stuck.
Yeah.
I've kind of gone with it harder than usual in the last couple of years, but yes, the Never-Ending Tour of Everywhere. We're on a pit stop at the moment. Yes.
And the pit stop. So this is amazing and impressive. The pit stop is record a record. Is that what you've been doing?
Yeah, I've been making a record. I mean, I'm speaking to you from my studio right now. I'm fortunate enough to, in the pandemic, I moved out of the big city. And one of the nice things about moving to the countryside is I can afford to have a studio down my garden. It is small and perfectly formed, as you can see. But we're doing backing vocals over the next few days, but otherwise we're done for the next album. People should calm down because that doesn't necessarily mean that it's coming out immediately soon. It'll be kind of spring next year, but I'm excited about it.
That's cool. And so you carve out that time and you have like a good sense when you go into the studio to spend 2 weeks or whatever that you're going to be able to do it. You've got
Yeah,
these.
there are bands. It took me years to figure out. Like when you read sort of stories about bands spending 6 months in the studio, I was always like, doing what? Because I've always been. I mean, initially out of necessity, like I've always arrived at the studio with everything ready to go, and it's a kind of documentation thing. And it took me years to realize that bands were actually kind of writing in the studio and working out arrangements in the studio. And it was like, oh wow, no, what a waste
Yeah.
of time and money. um,
Yeah, and that's probably not incidental to like this conversation we're having with you and against
oh
me. It's like
sure.
you're the type of people writing songs, you're songwriters, and so you have
Totally. But
yeah.
even, I mean, and we will get further into this, but like, for me, like this record that we've just made, we've probably spent about 2 weeks total making it. We've been rehearsing it for 6 months,
Okay.
like, so, I mean, and I guess some bands do that whilst also paying studio rental, which seems idiotic to me.
That
But,
does.
but yeah, so, we were in good shape when we started.
So we're kind of talking. I'll give you a little bit of my background with this. Is
Sure.
like I don't need to say this too much because otherwise I'm going to say it on every fucking episode of this podcast. But grew up listening to some punk music, and then with my family's like singer songwriter music, and then this thing happened in like the 2000s where, in whatever way, big or small, in a way that just fully caught my attention, these two things found like they
Sure.
crossed paths in a way
Yeah.
that happened definitely with Against Me, and then I pulled it up just because I want to mention it. I looked it up online, but I had one year where I was subscribed to Alternative Press magazine, and it was June 2008. Quiet is the New Loud. I don't know if you remember stuff like this or if they even interviewed people, but it just was uh Paul Baraboo, Frank Turner, Andrew Jackson Jihad, now AJJ, and it was about this like idea of kind of folk
Huh.
punk music. And I was like, I literally wrote down all three things because I was like, hmm, like, and that magazine, I'll be honest, like it was a lot of like, think 2008, it was a lot of like emo music doing like emo music becoming mall music or something,
Yeah, totally. Diagonal haircuts. Yeah.
yeah, which was not my jam. It's diagonal haircuts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. You know what I mean by that.
Exactly.
There was I always think this is not really relevant to this, but there's a fantastic line in Propaganda song where he's the Back to the Motor League, where he's just kind of dissing kind of mainstream quote unquote punk bands, and his line is rounding off the jagged edges. And I feel like there was a real process because I mean this isn't really relevant to what we're talking about, but it's on my mind. But like I got into emo before My Chemical Romance, and it was like there wasn't really a clear defining line between emo and screamo, and emo was a kind of this kind of pretty weird left field, discordant,
Yeah.
noisy type of music, and then it sort of slowly got kind of sanded down into something that could be on the cover of AP, I suppose. But like, that was I mean, and of course, in saying any of this, I sound like a kind of uh, typically sort of male gatekeepy dickhead, basically, because I probably am being that. Nevertheless, that was a process of that period of time. But I mean, well, to try and bring this around to something relevant to what we're trying to talk about, like one of the things I always loved right from the word go with Against Me for me is that they didn't seem to fit that particular model of what was happening to punk rock more broadly.
For sins past sainthood, it's like I'm dying to forget. Our sleepless nights I'm perfectly alone and still. I can drink till victory, I'll drink to the mighty. Drink until I die, or at least until the sunrise. When honesty, as popular as a plague, comes to remind me the dead's winning the race with me. Going nowhere, right down the street, a prostitute is selling the closest thing to love that this country has to offer.
Yeah. All right. So beautiful. That feels that way to me too. And
Yeah.
what I think because in my mind I associate your music so much, I don't think I really like grasped that like what Against Me was doing started at like 2000 and Campfire
Yeah.
Punk Rock comes out in like 06. So by the time you're
Yeah,
making
totally.
the full things, like
Sure.
you're basically making Love Iron song at when New Wave is happening almost, right?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. They as a band feel like they're kind of like and maybe a generation is too strong a word, but like a couple of like high school years above me. You know what I mean? And I mean, they truly are. So, but I mean, so my experience of it, like in 2000, I want to say, when I'd sort of just kind of properly moved to London. I was kind of staying in kind of doss houses and squats and that kind of thing, and just sort of like trying to be a full-time punk rock person and go to shows all the time, playing bands, and you know, the usual kind of thing, and kind of working crappy sales jobs during the day. And I remember being at a house party, and a friend of mine gave me a cassette that had "Crime as Forgiven By" on it, as if it was drugs. Is the thing I always remember. Like, he slightly palmed it off to me.
God,
Do you know what I mean? And he was like, "This is going to change your world." And it's funny that what you say about them kind of Against Me being an instance of bringing the kind of singer-songwriter tradition and punk rock together, because I think that you're right, but that wasn't quite the appeal for me personally, because the whole thing for me was that I grew up, my parents don't really believe in modern music, so I was self-educated. I was an autodidact in music, and that meant that I knew everything about metal and then punk and then grunge and then hardcore, and didn't know anything at all. I mean, I knew absolutely everything. I knew the song that Bob Dylan wrote propaganda songs by the Minutemen before I'd ever heard a song by Bob Dylan. Do you know what I mean? Like, I knew everything, but I could have told you everything about the Cro-Mags before I'd heard a single song by Johnny Cash, or indeed the Beatles, for that matter. So it was you know, but the one kind of like wild card was that my older sister got me into stuff like the Levelers. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're a kind of British folk band from the early 90s, kind of in the vein of like the Pogues and stuff like that.
Okay.
And then there was also I was and indeed still am a huge Counting Crows fan. So there was a bit of kind of songwriteriness in my taste, in very sparing amounts. But so yeah, my friend gave me this record and was like, "This is gonna fuck you up, man." And do
you think, real quick, do you think he was giving that to many people saying this is going to fuck you up? Or do you think he saw like a certain proclivity in you that was like, Frank, this is going to fuck you up?
I think there was a fair few people he was giving it to, but I think he knew that it would land with me, especially, I guess. And I remember I was completely obsessed by Crime as Forgiven By. And then I don't think I got around to those acoustic ones in my first kind of pass, if you like. Reinventing sort of came along. I do remember kind of like, I mean, if we're now having this conversation about my overall relationship with Against Me, I felt like at the time, I felt like Reinventing had got a bit more full band than I wanted it to be. Do you know what I mean? Like, Crime was so stripped back, just kind of like toy drums or something, and like acoustic guitar or clean electric guitar or whatever it was, and shouting. Just seemed to be the vibe. And there was kind of like suddenly there was like two guitars and a bass player and all this kind of thing. And I remember in a slightly kind of, when you're a teenager trying to define yourself by sort of not enjoying things that other people are enjoying, being a bit too cool in places. But I mean, fucking whatever. Who cares, man? Like,
we make fun of people for being gatekeepers and hipsters and all this stuff, and I think that's a good like check and balance. But it's cool to like a thing before people know about it.
Oh yeah,
you know.
Well, and like I say, I do think. I think as long as you understand it in the context of, as I say, like it being a part of adolescent self-definition, which it definitely was for me. If you see what I mean, it was just You know, you define who you are by kind of drawing lines in the sand, or by pushing up against other lines, and all that kind of thing. I think it's a legitimate thing for kind of people in their teens and 20s to do. 40s less so. But anyway, I was completely obsessed with crime. I was kind of, and then I remember I saw them play at South by Southwest, I think, in about 2005, probably, or four, possibly even. And again, it was kind of like, it felt like it was kind of like a street punk show rather than a folk punk show. And I remember sort of not being that stoked about it. And then, so this is where I get full fat contrarian about everything, is that actually I kind of fell back in love with them as a band on New Wave. That was the record that kind of brought me back around to them as a band. And I'm aware, of course, of the entire kind of history, one might even say folklore of Against Me in that era, and the whole thing of the We're Never Going Home, and arguments about label structure and all that kind of thing, which even at the time as a kid who was reasonably tuned into that argument struck me as pretty over the top in that particular instance.
I love that. You know how delightful it is for me to hear from you, who makes campfire punk rock and goes on to make big band albums that can be played loudly, is that you got mad when Reinvent Axl Rose had a full band of bass players.
Yeah, totally.
On it. I loved it. Yeah. I love it.
But I mean, I guess I get, in some ways I still slightly took my eye off the ball with Against Me, if you know what I mean by that. Like, I wasn't sort of fully up to speed. And then I just remember kind of like there was a big kerfuffle around New Wave, kind of, you know, they signed a big deal. I mean that in the positive sense. Like, there was a buzz, there was a lot of people talking about them all of a sudden. It was like, oh, I know that band. Yeah, I know that band. And I kind of went and sat down and listened to it again and just kind of went, oh, fuck, this is like amazing. I mean, I do think so, with the caveat that, like, if we could direct all of the energy that people have expended on trying to define punk rock towards something like curing cancer, the world would be in a better place. Nevertheless, if you have to try and define punk rock, to me, it's the line from the song New Wave where he says, we can be the bands that we want to hear. It's like, there you go. That's it. Job done. Everyone go home.
We can be the bands we want to hear. We can define our own generation.
Like, it's just, it's, you know, and it's like, that song still makes me want to, like, kind of fucking jump through doors and like punch through walls and stuff. And I fucking love that record. And I think at that point I kind of went back and reinvested in reinventing a bit more, and you know, the things that I'd slightly overlooked in the intro.
Yeah, you said something a little bit earlier about like them being like a couple grades ahead of you in school or whatever.
Sure.
Kind of
Yeah.
And you also said something about some of the sort of kerfuffle being striking you even as a little bit over the top in the time. And with that band, I think it was about as heavily charged as it could possibly be. Does it?
Totally.
You did a thing that was, all right, I played in, I don't know what kind of music you call Million Dead. Is that screamo or hardcore adjacent or something?
Yeah. I mean, people called us post-hardcore at the time, and we got annoyed about the word post, but well, let's run with that now.
Okay. And so you swing like you make this Frank Turner record. That's this is a guy with a guitar now, right? That's a change.
Yeah,
it's
sure.
something you're doing.
It is. I mean, sorry, say.
A couple years go by, and it's only 2-3 years between then and when you're making like Sleep Is for the Weak and Love Iron Songs, and these, like, you seem like the thing that took Against Me like 10 years of misery and pain. You just did a version of that then, maybe a little bit less unburdened by like, I'm a full on like street punk anarchist and stuff. But I don't know. Do you feel like maybe you followed a wave? I don't know.
Possibly. I mean, I would say that, like, what I would say, and I might be kidding myself about this, but in terms of Against Me's impact on an influence on me as a musician, I think that came a little later. Like, you know, I started really sort of dialing into Laura as a songwriter around the kind of, and thinking about it I loved crime, and it was sort of in the background. But when I sort of started first doing solo stuff, I wasn't really thinking about that record all that much. To be honest, when I first started doing solo stuff, I was thinking about Neil Young to the exclusion of almost everything else, and ended up doing kind of a louder, more aggressive version of that because I didn't know how to play guitar and sing quietly at the time. But like, I wasn't trying to be folk punk in 2005. I was just trying to be Neil Young. It just didn't go very well.
I've since developed my relationship with folk punk in certain ways, but I know that like when I wrote down those names from that article, the thing because I think in theory, I want these two things together, you know, like these two things feel like my like musical identities or things that have grabbed me the most. But it's like, I would think like, why do you have to try to sound like you sing annoyingly? Why is this part of this identity? And Frank Turner didn't feel that way to me. And believe me, I love AJJ. I came around to, but I was like, at the very first time, I was like, I'm going to go back to that Frank Turner MySpace page and listen to those four songs again.
Thank you. I mean, I will say, hilariously enough, one of the things that I adore about AJJ, who are genuinely one of my all-time favorite bands, is that I feel like actually Sean is the punk rock Neil Young. Do you know what I mean? Both in terms of his musical and lyrical vision, but also his voice is pretty similar to Neil Young's voice in a roundabout way, in a way that mine never was. But so I mean, I guess I wasn't trying to be folk punk necessarily. I was trying to be kind of singer-songwriter / country almost in my early incarnation. But it's just that I didn't really have any musical education outside of punk rock, so it sort of came out how it came out. That's obviously kind of changed and developed over time. And I actually had a really fun thing on the record that I just finished where there's a song in it where I'm like, this is a self-consciously folk punk song, and it's the first one I've ever done where I'd actually allow that to be the case whilst I'm writing the fucking thing. But I think Against Me, the other thing that they did is that they were much more engaged in the kind of, anarcho crust, peace punk kind of thing when they started out than I ever was, or at least when they started out as Against Me. I mean, I spent a fair amount of time kind of hanging around kind of like Black Bloc and squatting and stuff like that when I was younger and when I was listening to Crime Is Forgiven By, but you know, I'm not off the top of my head sure of how old they were when like Reinventing came out, but by the time I was doing my early solo stuff, I was the mid to late 20s. Do you know what I mean? So like you know, in many ways, demographically or like age-wise, the comparison would be between Reinventing and the stuff I was doing in Million Dead, which was a bit more self-consciously anarchist in its way. My early solo stuff was kind of philosophically governed by a lot of cynicism, actually. Do you know what I mean? I was in the middle of being fucked off about everything. But you know, so the whole debate about Against Me and about the fact that, you know, they had their tires slashed and people showing up at shows and turning their back, and it was kind of like what happened to Jawbreaker on steroids and all this sort of thing. And as I say, at the time, there was part of me was like, oh, fucking really? Like, particularly when people getting that worked up about signing to Fat Wreck or whatever, and it was just crazy. It's like, you know, there's more world out there. You know what I mean? It seems so parochial to me, I guess, and I feel like Laura said this in her book, like there was slightly a degree to which they had danced with the devil. Like they did write that fucking song saying that they weren't going to play proper venues and whatever,
and sort of made a documentary about it. Like there's certain stuff that is their own.
Do you know what I mean? So they slightly dug a hole and then fell into it. But fuck me, I mean, like, you know, who hasn't fucked up? Do you know what I mean? And one of the things about what I do for a living and have been fortunate enough to do for a living for a long time, and them as well, is that you fuck up in public. Do you know what I mean? And like, and now people, the internet never forgets and all the rest of it. And it's like, you know, I look back, I did an awful lot of growing up in the public eye, and no one else has to give a fuck about any of this. But just on a personal level, it's just like, you know, there are so many things that I would now handle with grace and intelligence and all the rest of it that I didn't at the time. And it's because you're fucking 27 or something, and then the entire world's asking you questions. And indeed, I think in both of our cases, social media's just been invented. You know what I mean? So I do think there's a major thing for Against Me, and to a lesser extent for me, about if you look at when social media kind of became a thing. I think that there are you talked about the MySpace page thing. I mean, you know, that was the dawn of all of that kind of thing. And I think that that's not unimportant to the conversation, is that Against Me sort of became a band and became a phenomenon, became successful, and then became at various points regarded as traitors or whatever. All of this was completely intensified by this brand new form of technology, social media.
Yeah.
You know, it was back when something happened on Twitter and people were like, wow, what's happened on Twitter? Whereas now he goes, something's happened on Twitter, and everyone goes, honestly, who fucking cares?
Yeah, exactly.
At least that's my experience of it. People took it all much more seriously back then.
I think I think you're right. I mean, I think your experience, you could tell me if I'm putting this wrong, but like their experience was that documentary and songs that mention it, and Reinventing Axl Rose has 2 songs with the word anarchy in it, and all of in their titles, all of this. I feel like you're speaking about politics and personal experience and everything like that, but you're almost internally scrutinizing the nuance of like all sides and how much of a trap it is to try. Like there's no correct answer, right? There's no appropriate amount of success to have or whatever.
I mean, I would say at this juncture that like I hope I've never been rash enough to kind of to be normative or to be overly normative in politics. I'm realizing, as I said, that's just flat out untrue. I definitely have been at certain points, but like, I don't regard myself as confident enough to really tell anybody else what to do or how to live and all the rest of it. And I don't mean to cast aspersions on anybody else by saying that, because, for example, I know Billy Bragg, and he is often normative in his political statements, and he is smart enough to be that, and good, and all power to him, and all the rest. But like it's something that has always on some level made me slightly uncomfortable. And as I sort of mentioned, like my kind of stridently kind of banging the table and telling people what to think phase was more Million Dead. And by the time I started, Love Iron Song, the song is a song about being completely disillusioned with punk rock as a concept and with anarchist politics as a concept.
Well, it was bad enough, the feeling, and the first time it hit when you realized your parents had let the world all go to shit, and that the values and ideals for which many had fought and died had been killed off in the committees and left to die by the wayside. But it was worse when we turned to the kids on the left and got let down again by some poor excuse for protest. Yeah, by idiot fucking hippies in 50 different factions who were locked inside some kind of 60s battle reenactment. And I hung up my banner in disgust and I head for the door. Oh, but once we were young and we were crass enough to care.
There has definitely been moments in my career where I've sort of been slightly bemused with the joy with which kind of card-carrying anarchists have sung along with that song. And it's not that I'm having a go at them in any way, but it's just a bit like, this seems kind of weird. Like, listen, motherfucker. I guess what I would say, the last chorus of that song has always been dripping with sarcasm to me. And I realized after many years of touring it that it isn't sarcastic to some other people. And in many ways, maybe that's awesome. Maybe that's beautiful, actually. But it's just quite weird. It's weird for me. But yeah, so, I mean, Against Me did that. But I mean, I think that they successfully. So another thing, the big thing around New Wave is that they had signed with a major label, having spent however long saying they weren't going to sign to a major label. I didn't spend time saying that, but I remember when I did a license deal to a major label in 2012, and like basically no one really noticed. Which I remember being kind of like braced for the inevitable backlash, and I had all my kind of like rhetoric kind of lined up for the fucking you were doing this. And like, no one really cared. Just like,
the last guest I had on was Dan Ozzie, who wrote Sellout,
which I finished reading just the other day.
Did you? Cool.
Yeah, Dan's a beautiful guy. He's a lovely, lovely man.
Lovely guy, lovely book. And I mean, I think that's a little bit sort of the thing of the book, is that this idea of this being some fundamental thing. Against Me is the last chapter in that book. It doesn't mean no one ever scrutinized the idea of selling out or compromising yourself after that, but the whole landscape changed. I think you're a different band and person too, but that's fascinating that came out.
Right, totally. But I mean, I think that, and I would think I was thinking of Dan's book when I was saying that. I mean, I feel like by time, like I say, I was less hostage to fortune from previous things that I'd said or whatever, but like it felt, I mean, a lot of it has to do with the impact of the technology on the music industry and all the rest of it. But like by time I was really licensing to a major label in like 2013, like that fight was over. Do you know what I mean? It had been and gone. And it's like, I feel a bit like, it's like, we lost, dude, or whatever. It's just like, fucking get on with your life. And I think that there was a kind of general recognition of that. And like, it's funny because my sort of generational thing, I mean, I have a Fugazi poster on the wall behind me, and like I know Ian a little bit, and I always feel guilty when I hang out with him. just
Like,
in general. And I should stress that that's not on him in any way. Like, he's a perfectly lovely, non-judgmental person, but I just sit there feeling bad about my life choices. But again, it was like, those were conversations. I feel like the conversations about things like major labels were different in 1991 to what they are in 2023. And I think it would be weird to be surprised by that. But against me, I feel like, they caught kind of the last blast of that fight in a way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. It'd be funny if next week, like the Super Bowl comes up and some like spritzer, like alcoholic drink or whatever from some company puts New Wave on a commercial or something, and Against Me makes $1 million from it, and no one cares.
Totally. But then, I mean, it's a funny old that the advert thing is a good example of it, because when I was a kid, it was like, if you were a band, you had a song in an advert, you were the worst seller of all time. And I think that nowadays people don't feel like that, because I think everyone understands there's no fucking money coming from anywhere else in the music industry these days. Do you know what I mean? It's like, and there's certainly on a personal level, if I see a band getting a song in an advert, there's part of me that thinks, good for you, you guys are gonna be able to pay your rent for a year, and that doesn't suck. Do you know what I mean? It means you concentrate being a musician.
Have you ever had a song on an advert?
I've not, no. I've had my songs on the background of like soap operas on British television, which I have mixed feelings about, but fuck it. Like, I mean, it paid my bills.
Amazing. So you talked about, like, by 2012 no one cared, and Against Me is not just that major label thing that gets people revolting. Like, they get mad when Reinventing Axl Rose has a band, they get mad when Fat Records happens. There's sort of all this,
right?
Did you had that in 2012, and I say this as a person who I'll just like preload this question, like, when you made a thing with an acoustic guitar and then the next one felt a little bit more indifferent and then the next one felt a little more indifferent, I'm suddenly the protective person that's like, oh, fucking Frank Turner, what this is. But the thing is, so basically, were there a bunch of me's out there doing that needed to find out in retrospect that, oh wait, I like this, but in the moment we're protective or something? Like, did you feel anything like that?
There was a little bit, but I mean, it was tempered by a couple of things. It was tempered by the fact that, like, there is a full band on my first EP. There's this kind of weird sort of like fake memory that a lot of people have, that like my first releases were completely solo, and they just weren't. Do you know what I mean? There were arguably more just, in fact, they were more just solo songs on there. But like, the first track on my first EP has a full band on it. Do you know what I mean? In fact, it starts with a Hammond organ and a drum kit. So like, it's just a bit like, so that was one thing. And then also, it's just that basically, like, I was fortunate in my career, and I'm not quite sure how this compares to Against Me, but in my career, like, everything happened very, very, very gradually for me. Do you know what I mean? There wasn't like, I know people in bands who've had the light switch moment where they go in 6 months from playing to 200 people to playing 2,000 people, or indeed 20,000 people. And I think that that's very hard to navigate, and all the rest of it. And for me, it was just like, with each passing record, there are a few more people involved. And for a lot of people think that my fourth record is kind of my best record or whatever. By which point, kind of like, those kind of arguments were sort of moot, because the Sleeping Souls was an ongoing thing, and it had become clear that there was this sort of pattern of doing some songs full band and some songs solo and all the rest of it, and indeed touring in that way. So there was a tiny bit of it, but not much, cool. Not in a way that ever really bothered me that much about it. But yeah, I mean, Against Me, definitely, my God, the more I think about it, they got the shitty end of the stick on all of those things, like, endlessly. Do you know what I mean?
It seems pretty brutal. I think it's like, it's really kind of impossible to fathom, like, 1999 to New Wave or whatever, and then just think that there's this whole entire thing that is transgender dysphoria blues and Laura Jane Grace and everything that follows that. That's many lives. That's just a lot of.
Totally. But then, so this, you see, but that's a really good way of putting it, because I think one of the things I now understand better as an adult, and possibly, I mean, I was going to say as a songwriter, which
you can say that.
But like, as an artist, but I mean, it's like, artists should change, and there is this kind of temptation, and this is common across all genres of music, that certain types of people, and I have been one of them with certain bands, you discover a thing, it impacts your life, and you want it to be that forever, and you don't want it to change, you don't want it to grow. And like, there are certain artists that sort of get a pass on that, David Bowie or Radiohead or, whatever example you want to pull out of that kind of, you know what I mean? There's kind of certain artists who their changing nature becomes part of the USP, whatever you want to call it. But like, and I think that's individual from listener to listener, but a lot of people want a thing to stay the same as it was when they found it. And one of the things that on a personal level, which I find quite funny, is there are certain people like, man, I wish go back to his roots with Love Iron Song. But then there are people who be like, I wish go back to roots with Tape Deck Heart. It's like my fifth album, and it's just like, but that's when they came on board. You know what I mean? So it's just like, and I like to think, and I'm probably kidding myself gigantically, but I've now reached the point, I'm making my 10th record and things are going well enough for me to continue with my career and all the rest of it. And I think people have accepted that I am attempting to explore new avenues as I go by. I'm not AC/DC, you know what I mean, or Pennywise or whatever. And I say that with love for both bands.
Right.
But like, I think that bands should change. Artists, writers should change. There's something inherently conservative about the idea that they shouldn't. And it's just fucking boring ultimately. And like, I'm so glad that Against Me is a completely... And Laura as a writer is just completely different to what they were when they started out. Do you know what I mean? I think that's fantastic. That's how it should be. Is there anything more fucking tedious than somebody who repeats themselves over the space of album after album after album?
Absolutely with you on that. I think it's in the moment that people are like, I don't want this to change. This is a thing for me. And
totally. Well, and I think that, if I could go back in time and sort of give the members of Against Me a hug in kind of the early 2000s when they were suffering all this kind of thing, one of the things I would say is I think at this juncture that they are pretty kind of legendary, and part of the reason they're legendary is because of everything that they lived through, and one of the things that I've learned in my own career, and I've had my ups and downs and moments of being shouted at on the internet and all the rest of it, is that like time passes. Do you know what I mean? And like, if you're still standing up at the end of it, you garner a certain degree of respect. And I just think that like there's a kind of aura, there's a mythology around Against Me. And again, maybe I'm kidding myself. Maybe there's loads of people out there who grow up just hating Against Me still because they signed to Fat Wreck or whatever the fuck. But I think
if you're listening to this and you're one of those people, reach out to me and let's talk it through.
But I just think ultimately I think that people look back now. I think that, again, maybe I'm just saying all this shit because I'm in my 40s, but it's a bit kind of like, I'm not saying that it's not unimportant, the kind of politics around the kind of corporate structure around record labels and all the rest of it. But ultimately, all of that's a fucking sideshow from the music, And now you can sit back and listen to 20 plus years of Against Me's catalog and go, what a fucking great band. They made a lot of great songs and they moved forward. They said different things. They explored new territory. White Cross is a fucking sensational record. Transgender Dysphoria Blues was just completely like a new benchmark, both for them and I think for the scene more broadly. All of this is so much more important than arguments about like corporate structure and who's paying the A&R guy's salary and did so and so have points. I mean, who fucking cares, man?
In your experience with like when you were coming up and all that, did you spend much time in Gainesville? Do you have any much exposure to the city of Gainesville? And I'm trying to, I'll just say this, like I'm trying to draw some line between Tom Petty and Against Me in some way that I don't.
Oh yeah, sure. I will back you on that quest. I think that's entirely appropriate. I mean, you could start with just the simple fact that you're talking about two great songwriters.
Yep.
And not every band is songwriter based in that way. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Like that's not true of every band, but I think it is. In the case of Laura Jane and Tom Petty, I mean, how much they have in common beyond being songwriters and geography, I will leave you to explore at your leisure. But I know Gainesville a little. I remember as a kid, I used to get the No Idea Records mail order catalog mailed to me in England. And like, I mean, I don't want to blow my own trumpet too much, but I think there was probably a grand total of about 8 people who did that in the 90s, and
that's cool. Yeah.
And, me and my friend, we used to kind of pool our resources and like mail order stuff like Small Van Bryke, I Hate Myself, 12-Hour Turn, Hot Water Music, that kind of thing. Back in the days when you had to read a paragraph to describe a record before you paid money for it because there was no other way of listening to it at the time. And sometimes you get the coolest record you ever got in your life, and sometimes you'd end up with some fucking oof, yikes. This, I mean, we live. It's. I was going to say we live in a try before you buy culture. You just don't buy these days. Do you know what I mean?
Right,
That's not.
right.
Which has pluses and minuses. But anyway, so I mean, Gainesville was certainly kind of like a slightly kind of like almost fantastical place in my mind. Do you know what I mean? It was this mystic land of Southern Florida and kind of punk rock. And I remember kind of against me feeling like the last great Gainesville band in a way, in the early 2000s. And then I also, I remember the first time I ever went to Gainesville. I did the fest in 2007, I think it was. I did a bunch of touring with Fake Problems, who obviously,
Cool.
Are you talking to Chris Farron for this?
I should. I haven't reached out yet, but
Yeah, you should drop him a line because he'll have a lot of interesting things to say about.
definitely saw Fake Problems with Against Me on a show or two back.
Right.
In the day.
I mean, well, I very randomly got asked to. I got an email in about 2007 asking if an American label based in Naples, Florida, could release my first EP on vinyl in Florida, kind of thing. I was like, "Fuck yeah!" Nobody else cared. So, and then it turned out it was Good Friends Records, which was Casey Lee, and he hit me up and he said, "Do you want to do some touring to promote this record? I've just spent a bunch of money pressing." So I went and did a kind of like house tour of Florida with Fake Problems in 2007, and it was totally deranged, in a wonderful way. It's one of my kind of like pristine punk rock touring memories. But you know, one of the things for me about that was that they were an Against Me adjacent band, which made me excited when I first sort of encountered them.
You mentioned those shows. Like I read your book, and I just love the thing where you have documented every show you've played. There's a running list of every show you've played.
Yeah.
It must have been very handy when you went to write that book too.
Oh yeah, I mean 100%. And actually, I mean the reason that I started doing the show counting thing is the drummer in Million Dead started doing it, and I thought he was out of his mind. And then actually, even before the band broke up, I was really stoked he'd done it because it's difficult to remember every show on a tour. And I'm not saying remember the details, but just remember where did you play on that tour, and it's like hold on, and to have it written down was kind of cool. But it's also in the early days I toured my own, so I wanted to have some sort of record of what I've done, because there's not even someone I can call up and just be like, hey, what did we do, because there was no one else there.
Yeah, I don't know, life is all just a big scattered mess of things, and it's nice to have things like that. And I actually feel that way with like recorded music, right? Like you're Against Me has this, you have this. I mean, you described like the Neil Young thing or David Bowie in his own way, whatever. You kind of seem to me like you're like, oh, I'm going to make this record that's going to be sort of this way this time. And I'm going to make one that's tapping into like the hardcore music I played in the past. I'm making one that's explicitly contemplating the idea of positivity in a time that's kind of fucked up. And, or my heart, a record about a heartbreak or something. Can you talk about what you went in and did these last 2 weeks?
Oh yeah. I mean, well, I mean, the first thing you say is that you're right. Sometimes that kind of like, thematicism is like emergent rather than planned, if you see what I mean. Like, I mean, it differs. I mean, No Man's Land, I sat down to write a history record, and I did. Sometimes it's like, and the way you judge this is kind of at what point the album title shows up more often than not. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like England Keep My Bones, was the album title was the very last thing that showed up for that record, and there's a degree in terms of track listing and picking which songs go on the record. There's a degree of kind of curation of an idea at that point. But having said all that, I mean, the record that I've just finished is very nearly finished. It's kind of I just think it's kind of hilariously unlikely that I'm 41 and making my 10th record, have just finished a major label deal, and I'm still fucking doing what I do. And there's a kind of insurrectionary kind of thumbing of the nose in how I think about where I stand at this point in my life. And I feel like that's kind of come across in the music. It's kind of, I have a new drummer in my band, and this is the first time he's recorded with us. And to me, it sounds like a bunch of people having fun. It's kind of a punk record. It's kind of a record about being in your early 40s and still making punk records. I mean, it'd be overly self-referential, but growing old disgracefully is certainly a part of the mix. I'm really stoked. Like I say, it just listening back to the kind of rough mixes, it just feels like a bunch of people enjoying themselves, which is not true of all the records I've made.
I love that. I'm 41 and through this deal, and now I'm gonna write my first explicitly folk punk song on purpose.
Yeah, do you know what I mean? There was something slightly like "fuck everybody" about that. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean? In a
yeah.
way that I quite like, and yeah, you know, I'm really proud of FTHC. But looking back on that, my most recent album that's been out, is like that feels kind of like a transitional record for me. That was a record where I was kind of allowing myself to just sort of go, hey, maybe I'm going to make punk rock music without any adjectives. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Like that would be okay. But that's a pretty fucking angry record, and there's some dirt under the fingernails, some rage underneath thing, but it's broadly speaking, it sounds like people enjoying themselves. I've made a
Killer.
fun album. Jesus.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Something I thought of earlier that just like I listened to this podcast about the the Lisa Loeb song "Stay."
Yeah.
And it was interesting. I found her to be, she wasn't being interviewed. They were talking about it. It was like the 60 songs that explain the 90s podcast, and it was about how she very, very deliberately at the very beginning, when people were calling her a folk musician, which especially before that song, she sounded like a folk musician, and she was like deliberate about pushing back and being called a singer-songwriter in this weird like advanced move of like, the next album is not going to sound like the, and sort of
sure.
regardless of success or whatever. It was this, I never even really thought about the differentiation of that. I just thought like, but you
Totally.
be a singer songwriter, and it's like, I'm going to do this on this record. I'm going to do this on this record. You're not just a
Yeah. Oh, totally. Well, I mean, so I find that very interesting. By the way, I didn't know that about Lisa Loeb. And it's smart because, like, there are days when I curse myself because of the only word that people get more annoying in their arguments about it than punk is probably folk.
Yeah.
And it's like you end up with both of them hanging around your neck, and it's like, why have I done this to myself? Like, Jesus Christ! And I always remember my friend Scott Hutchison, Frightened Rabbit, who's no longer with us, alas, but he
God,
was
yeah.
not from the punk world in any way. And he used to just kind of look askance at the arguments that I would either be part of or be sort of intellectually involved in about everything that we're talking about with Against Me or whatever. And it was just completely foreign to him. He'd be
Right.
like, why does anyone fucking care at all? And nobody cared at all about Frightened Rabbit's label situation because everyone just went, well, they're a band and we like their music, and that's the end of that conversation.
God.
And it is, for better and for worse, it is a peculiarity of certain scenes and not others to care about all this shit at all. That's kind of what I mean about the parochialism thing, about people losing their mind about Against Me signing to Fat Wreck of all labels. Do you know what I mean? It's just a bit like, there's like other bands, there's other music, there's other labels, there's other people who just, it's so kind of small-minded in many ways. Do you know what I mean? And but then on the flip side, of course, I understand it's people being defensive of the thing that's really important to them, that gives their life shape and meaning. And I don't ever want to be disparaging of that, because many times in my life, punk rock has given me that safe space, that meaning, that defense, whatever it might be. So I don't want to be overly dismissive about these things. Anyway, but so in my early days, I was using the word folk to describe what I do, slightly kind of ideologically, slightly kind of distancing myself from my old band. I still have a theory that like folk music, that rock and roll is modern folk music. Actually, if you look at what the sociology of folk music in the 19th and particularly 18th century, the only thing that comes close to that in the modern world is rock and roll.
Yeah.
Or pop music more broadly, popular music. I mean, you get in danger of defining yourself out of making a point somewhere in here, but like the folk music has been, now is this kind of slight museum piece for some people, and I'm like, that's the whole fucking point, is it wasn't that in the 18th century. Do you know what I mean? It was the songs people sang in a field. To me, what's a folk song? A folk song is a song you can walk into a bar and sing the first line of, and everybody else joins in. So Bohemian Rhapsody is a folk song, actually. Do you know what I mean? Like, anyway, so I was sort of having all these kind of arguments with people and pissing those people off in the trad folk scene by doing this because I had nothing else to do with my time. But the singer-songwriter thing, I mean, it's always been a two-word expression that slightly makes my skin crawl. Just because it makes me think of fucking Jack Johnson, basically. And like, I hope Jack Johnson lives a happy and fulfilled life, but I'm not a fan of his music. There's something slightly kind of like mushy about the word singer-songwriter to me.
Yeah.
Folk singer seems somehow a bit kind of like harder edged, I suppose. But maybe that's a generational thing, because I suppose in the early 90s for Lisa Loeb, it was completely the other way around.
I mean, she's probably coming from the perspective of, I mean, I guess she's thinking about it to some degree, but the frightened rabbit side is just like, this is what I
Oh
want to
yeah.
be, and I want this.
Well,
I'm
yeah.
unburdened by
Ultimately,
whatever.
this is one of the nice things about releasing music under your own name is that you do slightly reach a point where it's like, what are you going to fucking do about it, man? It's on my passport. Like, oh no, he released a thrash album. Well, it's still my name. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
A drum and bass remix album.
It's like glaringly obvious now as we talk, but like with the folk thing, like against me adding drums on reinventing Axl Rose and a bassist and then signing to Fat Records and signing to a major label. That's early 2000s folk punk kids. I mean, that's Bob Dylan was folk music. That was folk music. And then he did his thing. Like, why?
Yeah.
There's no reason that it should be like ubiquitous knowledge to people who barely even know about music that like Bob Dylan going electric was a controversy. That like sentence is like a well-known understood thing, whether you know that it's probably like erroneously passed through history with all kinds of inaccuracies and stuff.
But then the funny thing about it though is that actually that to me, in retrospect, as a grown up, that's almost the moment when Bob Dylan starts to get really interesting.
It's the best. It's the best. Yeah, that's what I mean. I mean, I think that about I talked on another podcast recently about like, oh, I liked some like folky bluegrass band, and they went, and I felt that way about them. But it's like, would I want to hear a songwriter I like just make their little folky bluegrass things forever? I wouldn't have wanted that. I would have peeled off anyway from that. I don't know. Totally. You don't know that basically Highway 61 Revisited is challenging you in a way that then is going to give you more, even if at first you're like, what the fuck, dude, this isn't what we do.
Yeah, completely. Well, I mean, I guess there's somewhere in here, there's a divide, which I think it's important to present in a non-value judgment kind of way between people who want to be challenged by their art and people who don't. There's actually nothing wrong with not wanting to be challenged by the art that you like, partly because all art is subjective and anyone telling somebody else what they should or shouldn't be into is fundamentally ridiculous. But also, people take different things from art, and that's fine. You don't get to tell anybody else what they are or are not allowed to like. And that statement in and of itself has quite a lot to do with the whole against me argument. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It's like, stop doing music wrong. And it's like, you can't say that to an artist, or at least not when they maintain. It's the great debate. It's like, which is more integral, to do what the fans, quote unquote, want, or to do what you want to do? And I think there's one answer to that question, personally. And if what Against Me were pursuing was their own artistic direction, then they should have told everyone to go fuck themselves and do whatever they want, and that's what I think that they did.
Last night a room felt drunk, sang along to the songs I never had the courage to write, given the chance to stay in this chorus forever, where everything ugly in this world is sad and beautiful in a desperate memory.
Obviously, I think some people, the counter argument is they pursued all those things because they were interested in commercial success or whatever. But then here's the thing: like the very idea, which is at the heart of punk rock, which I accepted like mother's milk until my kind of mid-30s, is the idea that there's some necessary disconnect between commercial success and artistic worth doesn't hold any water. Actually, do you know what I mean? If something's really good, it might be because it says something profound. If it says something profound, then lots of people might be interested in that profundity. Do you know what I mean? And I think one of the things, I'm slightly rambling here, but one of the things I find really funny is that sort of the secret kind of ghostly guiding figure of the kind of 2000s folk punk thing has actually sort of been Bruce Springsteen, who is a man who is insanely successful and has always been on a major label. Do you know what I mean? Therefore, like, what the fuck, man? But like, it's... if something chasing commercial success or chasing a larger audience shouldn't be an inherently morally disreputable thing to do, because art is a form of communication ultimately, and it may be that what you're trying to communicate has a very, very niche appeal and a parochial and conservative appeal, and it may be that it doesn't, and both of those things are okay.
Lost the confidence to write a song, so I found 3 simple chords and held them together with my weak voice on an out-of-tune guitar my father gave to me. And
So I said this in the email that I sent to you, but I want to say it just because like I'm like talking to you right now, and I appreciate this opportunity. But I'm not like a. So I was at a show. I think it was maybe like Murder by Death, maybe Gaslight Anthem. I don't remember who this was, but you were opening this show acoustic in San Francisco, and I went to this show, and my
remember it distinctly. It was me, The Loved Ones, Murder by Death, Gaslight Anthem.
For sure. Yep, that's it. And so I'm there, and at this time you were. I don't think the record with Dan's song was out yet. But you were playing it. So I didn't even know the song yet, but I'm there. None of my friends showed up. I lived in San Francisco. I went to this. None of my friends were there. And I'm there. I have a backpack on and I'm drinking a Guinness. And you ask if anyone wants to play a harmonica, as you did at that time.
Right.
And I don't know how to put this, because this is going to have like a little end part after this, but like, like energy in a moment in a room. I'm like, this motherfucker is going to point to me right now. I can tell. And I just like raised my hand, got pointed at, went up and did it. So fun, got key harmonicas in the right key, whatever you do it. It was fun. Yeah. So like 6 months later, you come back with a full band and do that thing again. And I'm not kidding. I'm like, why can I just feel in the moment like I'm going to get pointed at again for this? And I raised my.
Hold on. Did you get up again and do it for the second time?
So I got pointed. You pointed at me again. I was like, I'm like energy juju or whatever. I'm not like wired that way necessarily, but I was just sort of Yeah. And so I got called up, and then I went up there, and then I was like, can I say something in the microphone real quick? And I could tell you were like, all right, bro. Yeah, sure. Whatever. Like, go for it. And then so then my friend came up and did it instead, because I'd already done it.
I remember that. I absolutely remember that. I remember because you were the first. It was the first time ever that somebody had got called up twice, as it were, and it was, which has been a thing that I'd been sort of scared that was going to happen at some point.
The thing about it to me was the weird feeling of like, if you like enter a raffle, whatever, you're like, whatever, that's gone. I don't.
Yeah, sure.
It was just some weird feeling of like, I'm gonna get called on for this. I already know it. I know it for a fact. Whatever.
Well, it's nice. It's nice to reconnect.
I'm gonna close that. Yeah, close that loop, because we just to say we've jammed together. Before.
Okay, and it was great.
You over the years have toured with Against Me some, right, or played shows at least.
Yeah. No, we've toured together. I invited them out on tour in 2011 on a UK tour. They opened for me. They were the special guests, you know what I mean? And I was super stoked about it. It was one of those, it was an interesting moment though, because it was sort of like my kind of mainstream star, for one of a less loaded descriptor, was kind of rising in the UK at that time. And I remember they basically scared the piss out of my audience in a way that I thought was amazing. Yeah. But like, my booking agent was a bit like, because like I remember that they had a 45-minute set, and they walked on and were like, good evening, played like 18 songs or something stupid, and then went, thanks very much, and walked off again. They didn't talk, they didn't stop, and it was just totally punk as fuck. And I grew up watching videos of Who's Skidoo do that kind of shit, and I thought it was cool as fuck. But I remember like one of the guys in my band, but most of the guys in my band don't have any sort of background in punk rock, and they were kind of like, they didn't really know who Against Me were, and they were like, what the fuck is these guys doing? They don't say hi, they don't talk to anyone. And I'm like, isn't it amazing? I just mean on stage, they were perfectly sociable. Backstage, that I think was the last tour before Laura came out, actually, funnily enough, was that with us. I do remember she was growing her hair out on the tour. But we made friends, and like Jay Weinberg was in the band at that point as well, who I saw just the other day when we played a show with Bruce Springsteen. Lots of connections. But yeah, we toured with them then, and then Against Me played at Lost Evenings 3 in Boston in 2019, which was awesome. Really stoked to have them. So yeah, we've shared the stage a bunch over the years, and then Laura and I have done a bunch of shows together too.
So come on, old friends, to the streets. Let's be 1905, but not 1917. Let's be heroes, let's be martyrs, let's be radical thinkers who never have to test drive the least of their dreams. Let's divide up the world into the damned and the saved, and then ride to the valley like the old light brigade, and straighten our backs and we won't be afraid, and they'll celebrate our deaths with a national parade. So come on, let's be young, let's be crass enough to care.
Say hi real quick.
Okay.
Hello. Hi, how are you?
There you go.
Oh, wait.
Yeah, you got to get it.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, it's so nice
we-
to see you again.
It's nice to see you. How are you? Where are you guys in
Good.
Northern California?
No, we are in Washington, northern Washington, on some islands up
okay.
there.
Oh, fucking A. Nice.
Yeah,
Excellent. That sounds very
it's
nice.
amazing. So if you ever want to come up, you have a place to stay.
That's very kind of you to say. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Beans and Toast stayed with us.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh, amazing.
when we were living in California. But yes.
Well, Jay has slept on my floor and indeed spare room and sofa and all the rest of it more times than I care to remember. But that's very cool. That's very cool. Hopefully I'll be up around your guys' way again before too long.
Yay. All right.
Cool.
Well, take care.
Cool. Nice to meet you.
Hey, for real, this was a pleasure. Have a good next interview. Thanks for talking against me. And
Hey, thanks, man. Yeah, all the best, man. Take care. See you
Appreciate it,
later.
Frank. Take care.
Thanks, man. Bye.
So I had this experience when I made the second season of this show, which was about Bright Eyes, where Tim Kasher of Cursive agreed to be on the first episode. And I was just elated. It's just like a cool, kind, nice thing to do that he just didn't have to do. And I feel kind of that way about this Frank Turner one. He said, yes, I'll come on and talk about Against Me. No need to do that. He did that on a 2-week break to record a record. I'm deeply thankful for it. Go find him online. Go catch a show on the never-ending tour of everywhere. And yeah, you can find me on social media at Routine Layup. And there's also a Patreon for this show. There's currently video clips from that Frank Turner interview that are on there right now. In future episodes, I'll put the bulk of the interview here on this channel, but there will be some special extra pieces on the Patreon. That's patreon.com/After the Deluge. You can go there not only for those extra little things, but just if you want to support the creation of this show, which I try to put a ton of love and care and work into. It's just one $5 tier, and by subscribing, you also get a zine. Kind of a print companion to this series, a little thing you can hold in your hands after it's all done, get mailed to your house at the end of the season. Again, that's patreon.com/After the Deluge. Tell a friend about this show if they like Against Me. I'm Justin Cox, and next up, we got Reinventing Axl Rose, baby. So make sure you're subscribed. Stick around. If you enjoyed that clip, you should check out the After the Deluge podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. We have full episodes there, as well as right here on this YouTube channel. So hit the subscribe button and maybe check out whatever's being suggested to you right here. Thanks so much.